Dante, as you know, because you have seen my exercise records on more than one occasion, I like lifting weights. I do not like cardio. It's just not, it's boring. It's boring, especially in the gym. You get on the treadmill and they're playing stupid fail videos that aren't very funny. And the music in there is awful. So don't forget your headphones. But beyond that, it's just repetitive and dull. Do you have any solutions, any suggestions that you could make that might help alleviate the boredom?
I think so. Let's talk about 3 points.
All right.
That can make conditioning or cardio a little more engaging if you are the person who likes to skip it altogether.
Cool. Hit me.
So the first point is to forget optimal.
Okay.
And so not that we want to neglect all of the research that we've talked about that, discuss different strength and conditioning best practices that might improve a given, specific outcome. If you want to lower your mile time or you want to increase a 1 rep max or whatever the case. Not that we ignore that totally, but we just, use it a little bit more cautiously for somebody who's completely ignoring or skipping this part of their health, this part of their exercise completely. So it helps to talk about what optimal really is.
Yeah.
And I think it would be a fool's errand to try and flesh that out fully because it's often context dependent, it's goal dependent. And so in this case, what optimal is to me is something that nudges you towards the somewhere close to what the physical activity guidelines are. So we talk about those reference ranges quite often.
Right.
150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity per week. And so that is in a perfect world, you slot in 30 to 45 minutes or an hour at a pop of a single modality, whether that's running, walking at a brisk pace, swimming continuously for those blocks of time. So that to me, and we could poke holes in that, but I think that is very close to optimal.
Okay.
Tyler, how hard is it to just take 30 minutes over the next 7 days, split it up evenly, maybe every other day, 30 to 45 minutes, and just hop on the bike and ride at a, heart rate of 125 beats per minute, conversational pace. How hard is it? Why are you skipping that? Well, there's a lot of reasons. There's just something for maybe for somebody who's not incredibly motivated in that respect, or they are somebody that cares a little bit more about the strength side of things, that there's just nothing really engaging about sitting on a single piece of equipment for boring. 30 minutes.
Yeah, it's just boring.
Right. Or if you're somebody, or if the weather's terrible,
yeah,
and you can't get out and hike, or you can't do things that are inherently more engaging than just looking at a monitor in front of you at a Globo gym.
Yep.
So those are the people that we're talking about. That's the kind of optimal we're going to set aside momentarily.
Okay.
And so with that said, it gives us our first priority, and that's to do whatever you need to do to stay engaged with conditioning. And so with this first point in forgetting optimal, I think this just gives you the freedom, the mental freedom that whatever you just end up deciding to do as we flesh out these next couple points,
right?
Whatever you decide to do, it doesn't matter when you do it. It doesn't matter necessarily what you pick, in what order, in what combinations. The fact that you find something to start doing is ultimately the key.
Right.
So this first point again is just to give you some grace that it's not what you decide may not look like the most optimal study talking about how to increase your time in the half marathon.
I have that conversation with a good friend of mine on the regular who is trying to figure out what the absolute best way to do an XYZ exercise is. And I keep trying to tell him, dude, it doesn't matter. You're talking about 1% or 2% better. Mm-hmm. Just do the thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I resonate with that in a different way as well, especially trying to, whether I'm just playing around writing training programs for a pretend person or a
sure.
pretend demographic.
Yeah.
Or I'm working on stuff that you've done or with what Nick's doing. There's something, sort of paralyzing about this over analyzing.
Yeah.
Should it be 25 minutes? Should it be 30? How quickly are they going to be able to transition from one machine to the other machine?
Right.
Is this really helping their VO2 max? Is this helping them at all?
Yeah.
Was it fast enough? Was their heart rate in range the entire time? Is what I'm giving them the right cue? Do they understand intensity and different levels of effort? So you can easily then all of a sudden you do nothing. And you lose your sense of creativity. And then you're like, well, the heck with it. Just sit on the bike for 30 minutes and watch Game of Thrones. And then you end up going back to that point. And again, unless you're that hyper motivated person and you have specific goals to improve your capacity on a bike while watching Game of Thrones, that's not going to be real exciting for most people.
Right.
So with that out of the way, the second point would be to get creative.
Okay.
And this is where some of the practical application will come in. And so by getting creative, or in order to get creative, you have to ask yourself, well, what do I even have access to? And so for many people, that maybe you have a couple pieces of equipment, or you have an old assault bike or old air bike in your garage that you can use, or maybe you have a rower, or maybe you belong to a gym that many of those cardio machines are situated close enough and the gym's not busy enough that you can potentially bounce around from thing to thing.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people may not be able to check any of those boxes, and all that they have, is a really big hill in their backyard or in the neighborhood, or a weight vest.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is, or they do want to incorporate running.
Yeah.
And so maybe it's going to be less machines than you would if you had access to off hours at a CrossFit gym or a Gold's gym or whatever the case. So as we take that one step further, regardless of what you end up doing, it's important to look at a total time goal. Because again, if we kind of think about the optimal conversation, we want to still strive to meet those guidelines in some sense. That looks like multiple hours eventually. Hopefully you can build yourself up to that point. Multiple hours of a week of cardiovascular exercise. We know that's what can maximize all of the benefits that are there to be realized from a health and performance perspective. Well, performance is a different sort of thing potentially, but we still want to keep that as maybe our North Star, but just know that you will potentially deviate and do some creative things before you get to that, before you're knocking out huge blocks of that.
Right.
So what you would theoretically want to do is take two or more movements. So 2 or more cyclical or monostructural movements, we'll call them. That's how many, program design people or CrossFit or the machine companies themselves, how they refer to their equipment. So what I'm talking about is a rower or a bike or an assault bike, or even, skipping rope or swimming. Those are things that you can continuously do. Walking, hiking.
Monocyclical meaning mono, one.
Exactly.
And cycle, it's one thing that you're doing over and over again.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, and again, we're talking about conditioning. We're talking about improving cardiorespiratory fitness. Having a monostructural exercise are the things that is the thing that can get you closest to, achieving those cardiorespiratory goals.
Right.
So what you will want to do in a practical sense is, once you've found out that time goal, put a couple of those monostructural exercises together. So let's just say you're just getting started and you're looking to knock out a 15 or 20 minute chunk. And that's all you have time for. And that's maybe all you can tolerate at this point. So you'll take that same 15 or 20 minutes, and instead of it just being 15 to 20 minutes, either running outside or walking up a hill or sitting on the bike and being bored and dreading it the entire time, you can say, if we pretend somebody has access to a rower and a bike.
Sure.
Well, what you would do is maybe you break that up into 1 minute on the bike, we'll talk about maybe the pace you're striving for. So this is not rocket science. 1 minute on the bike, 1 minute on the rower. That's 2 minutes per set times 7 to 8 sets. And so there you go. You knock out a chunk of conditioning.
Right.
And even though it was just by splitting it into a couple things, it inherently just it makes time move that much faster.
Yeah. Because you have to re-engage the brain and figure out how to do the thing that you just switched to doing, and that little change can make a big difference. That's a good point. Okay.
And so there are a million iterations of that. I mean, and that's why this is a point in ultimately encouraging you to get creative. I mean, there's so many. It doesn't matter. You could start with 45 seconds of each. You could start with 32 seconds of each. You could start with 1 minute and 30. You could do whatever you want.
Right.
But my one kind of but my pro tip, we'll call it, would be to minimize transition times between them. So if you've never rowed before, let's say, you have to strap your feet in, you have to turn on the monitor, and if you're not accustomed to whatever the given piece of equipment is, instead of it being a continuous effort, then you start to, next thing you know, you've built in a bunch of rest as you go from bike to rower.
Right.
And so that is certainly one critique to what I'm suggesting. But as you get more comfortable, you'll know that your feet don't really need locked down perfectly.
Right.
The monitor, you can just get started and it'll catch up. The bike, you don't necessarily need to clip your feet in for this.
Right.
The monitor, it'll start to go once you start pedaling. There are certain things that you can do to really make sure that it's a minimal transition time from thing to thing. Because not that how big of a difference is that making? I don't know. But if you take 20 seconds to go from machine to machine over the course of 8 sets, that's a lot of transition time.
Yeah.
And it sounds a lot like, suddenly you're a CrossFit athlete and you're trying to minimize and shave time off an event, but that's not what this is.
Right.
This is not a means of increasing intensity. This is you just moving smooth enough that when you transition from thing to thing, that you don't need the rest. It's just this conversational. It's as you have to treat it as if you are just walking the whole time or just biking the whole time or whatever the case.
Got it.
And another iteration of that, maybe you're just sick of running and you already have a base of support to maybe just try something new. Sure. Maybe instead of starting with 1 minute of each, you block off larger chunks of time. You can do 2+ minutes, 5 minutes, 6 minutes. And so I think that if you're somebody who's not real comfortable running long distances, or you're not somebody real comfortable even biking long distances, this is something you can work towards. But if you're somebody looking to just really make a hard pivot into things that can be more engaging, you can use those larger time domains instead of it being 2 things or 3 things for 1 minute times 5 sets. You're talking just 2 or 3 sets of given monostructural exercises for 3, 4, 5 minutes.
Okay.
And so maybe that's a little bit more of an advanced tactic, but you'll be surprised how quickly you can move into that larger time domain, because theoretically we're talking about moderate intensity cardiovascular activity.
Right.
This is not a high intensity circuit. This is not crushing yourself as hard as you can. I got to max out my calories on this bike.
Right.
Before I go over to the rower. This
Right.
is different. This is different than that.
Okay.
So the final point then, as you have set aside optimizing everything and you have now gotten a bit more creative and you're having fun doing this, how do you progress it over time? Because in a traditional sense, it's easy to say, well, I'm able to run for 20 minutes. And so next week, I'm just going to run for 25 minutes each time. And then after that, I'm going to run for 30 minutes each time.
Right.
And then 2 weeks after that, I feel really great. I'm going to test my 5K because
Yeah.
maybe that's a 20 or 25 or 30 minute time domain. And we'll see how much this is benefiting me.
Yeah.
Well, that's easy, but progressing something that's a little more mixed, other people will call it mixed cyclical movements. Progressing that can be a little trickier.
Yeah. Another
place where you can, paralysis by analysis sort of thing. So really all you need to do is if you're starting with 1 minute blocks over 3 and 4 weeks, you can increase those blocks to 1:30 each or 2 minutes each. Or if you notice that running is much harder for you than the bike has been, which for a lot of people it is, then you can just progress one of those elements and you can control the volume and keep the volume lower for whatever the thing is that's, challenging you. Maybe your ankles are sore or your shins are sore, your knees, whatever the case is. You can progress one thing and keep one thing the same. Or if you bit off more than you can chew when you can started, then you reduce one of those things and increase the other thing. There's a million ways to do it, but the goal is, again, I mentioned our North Star with trying to ultimately accumulate something close to that physical activity guideline amount. You still want to do your best to increase that volume amount over time as you become better able to tolerate it. The other thing that I like about using cyclical modalities like this is that you can ultimately keep as many variables the same. You can keep many variables the same. So notice that I haven't said that from week to week, you can increase the resistance on the spin bike, or you can, next week you're going to run up hills instead of just running on flat ground. I think that those are the elements that for moderate intensity cardiovascular activity, as you're just building this foundation of, cardiorespiratory fitness, you keep all of those things the same. You keep the resistance the same, you keep the damper the same, you keep the incline on the treadmill the same, and you progress the volume over time. And you potentially, what you'll start to see is, if you can only burn, according to the machine that you're using, if you could only burn 10 calories in a minute on a given machine, and it felt like an RPE 7 out of 10, or it felt like an effort level of 7 out of 10.
Right.
Well, in 4 weeks, you hope to see in that same minute, instead of burning 10 calories, it's 12 calories, but you didn't have to try that much harder to burn those extra 2 calories. Those are the sort of improvements in intensity, so to speak, that you will want to see over time, as opposed to artificially saying, well, I've been doing this for 3 weeks, so I'm going to increase the resistance on the rower from a 5 to a 10 just because I have to progressively overload this.
Yeah.
And so I say progress it, but that doesn't mean we want to artificially just make this harder for the sake of making it more challenging.
The time goal seems to be the more important one here.
For sure.
Okay.
For sure. And then again, you'll blink and you will have been doing something like this because it is just so engaging. You'll be 12 weeks in and you'll want to test maybe where you are. And so for a couple days out of that week, or maybe even just one session during the 12th week or the 13th week of you doing it,
yeah,
you just say, hey, I'm going to run the 5K, or I'm going to do a 5K time trial on the rower, or I'm going to test exactly what I've been doing. And I'm just going to test a 20-minute time domain on all these 4 or 5 different machines that I've been doing, and just see how it feels and see what paces I can come up with for the next cycle. And then ultimately where you end up is you kind of like conditioning. You feel really good doing it. It makes the time go by really fast. And then suddenly I think you're in a place where you are then better able to sit on the bike for 30 minutes or sit on the rower for 30 minutes. As daunting as that sounds initially, it takes a little bit of just gradual exposure to these different machines, or to walking, or to running, to then say, you know what, I did this for 12 weeks and my running didn't improve enough, or my biking didn't improve enough. So I'm going to take the next month or the next 6 months and I'm going to focus on that one thing, because that was the thing that was really holding me back last time. So at least you have to start somewhere and
Right.
trick yourself basically into liking it and making it look really cool and feel really cool. You're jumping from machine to machine and doing this. It's like, what am I doing? CrossFit? Like, what is this crazy thing I'm doing? You're not doing anything. You're not doing anything cool. People have been doing this for forever.
Yeah.
But it's just enough to kind of take the edge off so that suddenly you're just, it's never a thing to hop on the bike and grab 15 quick minutes or 20 minutes or go for a 20-minute run. It just takes a lot of, being great, just giving yourself enough grace as you find what you like to start.
Giving yourself permission to try things differently.
Yes.
It doesn't have to look like you thought it did.
It doesn't, right. It doesn't have to look like a half marathon training program. It doesn't have to look like a, 60-minute time trial bike program or a rowing program. It can be this really creative, fun thing that you would have never done otherwise. But because you're putting all these different elements together, it's like it's Pandora's box every time you walk into the gym, basically.
I kind of wish I'd thought of this a long time ago, like 20 years ago. Would have been nice. Very cool. All right. So real quickly, let me just hit those points again. So you said forget optimal. You're in this for time. It's not about squeezing out every ounce of efficiency. You said get creative, figure out different modes, using what you have and just make it work, and progress it over time. And that doesn't have to look like adding more resistance necessarily, or everything progresses at the same rate.
Yes.
The whole point is just to progress, full stop.
Your output over time should be greater without really that much of a conscious increase in your effort. So that's a key point.
I think that sounds doable, and I'm going to try this. Thank you.
Sounds great.
That's awesome. This is Tyler's counseling program. I love it.